Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. I'm Edward. Tell me, have you paused tonight to notice the small arrangements about you? The lamp's steady glow, the faint scent of paper and ink, the quiet comfort of a familiar chair. In such gentle hours, Watson often found reason speaking most clearly. If you enjoy these quiet reflections, do subscribe to Watson's Margins. Now, settle in, for it is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. And you will also find Watson's Margins on Spotify. The link awaits in the description below. Chapter 1. A Respectable Inheritance. It is a peculiarity of my long association with Mr. Sherlock Holmes that the cases which appear, upon first introduction, to be the most prosaic in their circumstances have invariably proven to be the most remarkable in their resolution. Such was assuredly true of that singular affair which I have since come to record under the title of the Vanishing Probate, a matter which began on a quiet spring morning in the year 1893, when the ordinary machinery of English law was found to have been subverted with a patience and ingenuity that even Holmes, I believe, was reluctant to admire too openly. I had called in Baker Street that morning with no particular purpose beyond the pleasure of Holmes's company, which, despite its eccentric demands upon one's nerves, I had long found preferable to idleness. Spring had arrived with unusual civility that year. The lime trees along the street were in fresh leaf, and the air, though carrying still a faint trace of the morning coal smoke that perpetually wreathed the city, possessed a lightness wholly inconsistent with London's habitual disposition. Holmes himself was in a mood of restless inactivity. He had been without a case of any genuine difficulty for nearly a fortnight, and I had observed in him those familiar symptoms of intellectual stagnation which his constitution endured so poorly. He sat in his armchair with a pipe and a copy of a German monograph on cryptographic ciphers, though I noticed the monograph had not been turned to a new page in the better part of an hour. "There is someone at the door, Watson," said he, without raising his eyes from the page. "He has been deliberating upon the step for some 30 seconds. A professional man, I should judge, who is accustomed to precision but finds himself in unaccustomed territory." I had heard nothing, but almost at once Mrs. Hudson's measured tread upon the stair confirmed it, and she presently introduced a gentleman whom I judged to be somewhere in his middle 50s, dressed in a frock coat of sober quality, carrying a leather document case that bore the quiet marks of long professional service. His face was composed and intelligent, and with grey side whiskers trimmed to an exactness that bespoke methodical habits, and his eyes, though steady, carried within them a suggestion of some considerable perplexity he was at pains to conceal. "Mr. Holmes," said he with a careful bow, "my name is Edmund Carberry. I'm a solicitor of Lincoln's Inn, and I have come to you upon a matter which, I confess, lies somewhat beyond the ordinary instruments of my profession to resolve." Holmes indicated the basket chair with a gesture, and leaned back with the air of a man whose energies have at last found a worthy object. "Pray sit down, Mr. Carberry. You will forgive me if I observe that you arrived this morning from the direction of the Strand rather than directly from your chambers, that you have consulted at least one colleague upon the propriety of this visit, and that the matter you carry in that case has been troubling you for no fewer than 10 days. Carberry stared at him for a moment with the expression I have witnessed so many times upon the faces of those encountering Holmes's methods for the first occasion. It is an expression compounded equally of astonishment and the half-formed suspicion that they have been followed. "You are quite right upon all 3 counts," said he, "though I am at a loss to account for the last. The clasp of your case has been opened and refastened many times in recent days. The leather about it is scuffed in a manner consistent with anxious, repeated handling. A man does not fidget with the evidence of a problem he acquired yesterday. But do proceed, Mr. Carberry. The particulars are more instructive than my small preliminary observations." Carberry settled himself and drew from his case a small sheaf of documents, which he arranged upon his knee with the habitual orderliness of his profession. He then laid before us a matter which was, in its bare outline, as follows. Sir Lionel Baskerly, lately a retired magistrate of the Somerset bench, and a man of unblemished public reputation, had died some 6 weeks previously at his residence near Wells. He had been, by all accounts, a bachelor of solitary inclination, a just and capable magistrate, a man of moderate private fortune, and a collector of Roman antiquities of sufficient seriousness to warrant occasional mention in learned journals. He left no direct heirs. His estate, conservatively valued at some £40,000, together with a considerable collection of artefacts, had been expected to pass by the terms of his will to a number of charitable institutions in which he had maintained a long-standing interest. Shortly before Sir Lionel's death, however, a letter had arrived at his solicitor's office, which was Carberry's own firm, from a young gentleman by the name of Adrian Baskerly. This individual represented himself as the son of Sir Lionel's younger brother, George Baskerly, and therefore the sole surviving blood relative of the deceased. He had spent, he explained, the past several years in Ceylon in colonial service, and had been, for reasons of distance and a long family estrangement, unaware of his uncle's declining health until it was too late to return in time. Sir Lionel, in the final weeks of his life, had received Adrian Baskerly, appeared to accept his claims of kinship, and had added a brief codicil to his will, acknowledging the young man as his nephew and principal heir. The will and its supporting genealogical affidavits had been duly registered at the probate registry of Somerset House by Carberry's firm, acting as instructed. Then, with a neatness that bordered upon the theatrical, the entire probate packet had vanished. Vanished, I repeated. Entirely, said Carberry. The will, the death certificate, the sworn affidavits confirming the codicil, and the genealogical declaration supporting Mr. Adrian Baskerly's claim, all gone from the secured cabinet of the registry as though they had never existed. Holmes had not moved throughout this recital. He sat with his fingertips pressed together and his eyes directed at some point upon the ceiling. "And the staff of the registry?" said he. "Men of the longest and most respectable service. The chief registrar, Mr. Fothergill, has occupied his position for 20 years. The clerk responsible for the Baskerly filing, a Mr. Samuel Pritchard, has been in continuous employment there for 15 years without a word against him. These are not men one suspects of dishonesty." "No," agreed Holmes quietly, "they are precisely not." He rose suddenly from his chair and moved to the window. Yet where he stood for a moment looking down into Baker Street with an expression I could not read. "Tell me, Mr. Carberry, has Mr. Adrian Baskerly offered any explanation of the loss, or expressed any particular anxiety regarding it?" Carberry appeared to consider. He has been, if anything, remarkably restrained. He expressed regret at the delay, and mentioned particularly that certain charitable bequests which he had hoped to honour from the estate could not be settled until the legal position was resolved. He struck me as a gentleman of genuine feeling. "No doubt," said Holmes, and there was in his tone something so precisely neutral that I glanced at him instinctively. His face was still turned toward the window, and I could make nothing of it. He turned at last and fixed Carberry with a look of calm attention. "I will look into the matter, Mr. Carberry. I should like to visit Somerset House at your convenience, and I should like also to have the opportunity of meeting Mr. Adrian Baskerly before very long. In the meanwhile, I will trouble you to leave with me whatever correspondence you have received from him, together with any sample of his handwriting that your files may contain." Carberry assented readily, and provided the documents without hesitation. When he had gone, I found Holmes already at the table with a magnifying lens in his hand, examining the letters with an absorbed and peculiarly concentrated attention. "What do you make of it, Holmes?" I asked. He didn't answer at once. When he did, he spoke without raising his eyes from the paper. "Where reputation is unquestioned, Watson, concealment often prospers. It is among the most durable of human arrangements." He set down the lens. "We shall go to Somerset House tomorrow morning, and I would ask you, as a particular favour, to observe Mr. Pritchard's cuffs." Chapter 2. The Orderly Machinery of Law. Somerset House in those years presented to the world a facade of such unhurried institutional permanence that it was difficult, passing beneath its great archway from the Strand, to imagine that anything within its stone precincts had ever occurred in haste or error, or with any motive less respectable than the smooth administration of English civil life. The building exhaled authority. Its corridors, long and cool even in spring, carried the particular silence of rooms in which important papers have been handled for generations, and the clerks who moved through them did so with the measured self-possession of men who have long since ceased to regard their surroundings as anything remarkable. Holmes was animated in the hansom on the way over. He had spent the previous evening, as I gathered from the state of the sitting-room upon my arrival, in close study of the documents left by Carberry, and from the scattered condition of his reference volumes, and the quantity of tobacco ash distributed across the deal table, I deduced that his examination had extended well into the night. He offered nothing of his conclusions. He sat with his hat pulled low and his long fingers drumming a private rhythm upon his knee, and when I ventured a remark upon the fine morning, he replied only with a sound that might charitably have been interpreted as agreement. The chief registrar, Mr. Fothergill, received us in his private room, a chamber furnished with the spare dignity appropriate to his office. He was a stout, white-haired man of deliberate manner, with small eyes that were observant behind their apparent placidity, and the careful courtesy of someone who has spent a career managing the sensitivities of those whose affairs pass through his hands. He expressed himself deeply disturbed by the disappearance of the Baskerly papers, and offered his full cooperation with a formality that left no doubt he considered the matter a stain upon the reputation of his department. "I will tell you plainly, Mr. Holmes," said he, settling his hands upon the desk, "that in 20 years I have not known a document to go astray within this registry. We operate upon a system of safeguards that would, I had supposed, render such a loss impossible. Each probate packet is entered in the daybook by the receiving clerk, verified by a second hand placed in the numbered cabinet, and the key held by the clerk responsible for that filing. The system is one of mutual check at every stage." "And the key to the cabinet in which the Baskerly packet was stored?" Holmes inquired. "In the possession of Mr. Pritchard from the moment of filing. He has it still. The cabinet shows no sign of forced entry." Holmes nodded, as though this confirmed something he had already supposed, and asked to see both the cabinet and the daybook. Fothergill conducted us himself through an inner door into the main body of the registry, a long room of considerable breadth, lined on both walls with ranked cabinets of dark oak, their brass fittings burnished to a military regularity. 6 or 7 clerks occupied high desks at intervals down the centre of the room, working in the focused quiet of men who understand that accuracy in their vocation is not a virtue but a duty. Mr. Samuel Pritchard rose from the nearest of these desks as we approached. I studied him with the particular attention Holmes had requested, and found a man in perhaps his 45th year, of middling height and unremarkable appearance, with thin, sandy hair beginning to recede from a broad, pale forehead. He was dressed neatly in the sober manner of his profession, and his manner toward us was cooperative to the point of eagerness. He answered every question fully, met our eyes without evasion, and gave every appearance of a man who is innocent and knows it. Yet there was something about him, some quality I could not at first isolate, that produced in me a faint and inexplicable unease. I remembered Holmes's instruction. I looked at Pritchard's cuffs. They were clean, as one would expect of a meticulous clerk, and properly fastened. But at the right wrist the linen had been worn almost to fraying at the fold, with a roughness inconsistent with a man of 15 years' seniority and presumably adequate means. A junior clerk in his first years of service might display such wear, the product of a desk edge or a habit of resting the wrist against a hard surface. But for a man of Pritchard's standing, and a man who otherwise dressed with evident care, it was a small anomaly. I could not judge its significance. I made a mental note of it and left the matter where it lay. Pritchard recounted his actions with the Baskerly packet in precise and unhurried detail. He had received it from Carberry's clerk on a Tuesday afternoon, entered it in the daybook in his own hand, verified the contents against the covering schedule, locked the packet in cabinet 14, and placed the key upon his person, where it had remained. He had not opened the cabinet subsequently. When the packet was required and found to be absent, his own bewilderment had been, he insisted, complete. Holmes examined the daybook at length. He turned back through several months of entries with an interest that appeared to exceed the immediate inquiry, running his finger down the columns of dates and signatures with an absorption that caused Fothergill to shift his weight once or twice in mild impatience. Holmes appeared not to notice. He then inspected Cabinet 14, the lock, and the surrounding area with the lens, crouching to examine the floor before the cabinet with the thoroughness that I knew from experience betokened real discovery. Though his face gave nothing away, Fothergill stood by his desk with the controlled discomfort of a man who's been vindicated, and yet somehow suspects the vindication is being assessed for flaws. Adrian Baskerly arrived at Somerset House while we were still in conference with Fothergill. He had been summoned by Carberry, who joined us at the same time, and the two men entered the registrar's room together. Baskerly was younger than I had expected, perhaps 32 or 33, with a lean, well-proportioned figure and a face that one might have called handsome in a quiet way, its features regular and composed beneath a moderate sunburn that spoke, plausibly enough, of outdoor years in warmer latitudes. He carried himself with the modest assurance of a man raised to some position in the world but uninclined to press it. He expressed regret at the inconvenience the disappearance had occasioned, hoped that the matter might be resolved without prolonged delay, and spoke of his late uncle in terms of simple affection. He mentioned in passing his years of service in the administrative offices at Colombo, and described the climate of Ceylon with a careful rueful humour that drew a sympathetic nod from Carberry. He answered Holmes's few direct questions without hesitation, and without, so far as I could judge, any trace of anxiety. I found him entirely credible. I said as much to Holmes as we descended the steps into the Strand afterward, the afternoon traffic flowing around us in its habitual indifference. Holmes was quiet for a moment. He raised his arm for a cab and did not look at me as he replied, "You are not wrong to trust your instincts, Watson. They are generally sound. It is only that in this instance the instinct is precisely what has been cultivated." He handed me into the cab and followed. Baskerly's colonial references were accurate enough in their broad outline, but he placed the administrative offices at a particular address in Colombo, which was relocated 11 years ago. A man who spent 3 years in that building would not make such an error. A man who had read about it in a consular report of 12 years' standing very easily might. I stared at him. "Then you believe he has never been to Ceylon at all?" "I believe," said Holmes, "that we are confronted with two performances, and that at least one of them is exceptionally well rehearsed. Whether Mr. Pritchard and Mr. Baskerly are confederates, or whether they are something rather more surprising than that, I'm not yet prepared to say, but I intend to know before the week is out." Chapter 3. The Disappearance Confirmed. 2 days passed before Holmes gave any outward sign of progress, and during that interval I confess my own thoughts returned repeatedly to the affair without arriving at any satisfying arrangement of its parts. I had by then sufficient experience of Holmes's methods to know that his silences were rarely empty, that the periods of apparent idleness in which he sat motionless for hours, or paced the Baker Street rooms in the small hours of the morning while I slept, were in truth the most industrious passages of any investigation. Nevertheless, the combination of a missing document, a composed and plausible air, and a long-serving clerk whose cuffs wore thin in the wrong places, produced in me a restlessness I could not wholly suppress. On the Thursday morning, Holmes appeared at breakfast with the alert, slightly sharpened look that I had come to associate with the early stages of confirmed suspicion. He said nothing of consequence until the post arrived, examined 2 letters with brief interest, and then pushed the marmalade toward me with an air of one who has made a decision. "I took the liberty yesterday evening," said he, "of calling upon a former colleague at the Colonial Office, a man named Rawlings, who spent 6 years in the Ceylon civil service before ill health brought him home. He was good enough to answer several questions regarding the administrative arrangements at Colombo during the period in which Mr. Adrian Baskerly claims to have served there. And, I said, and his answers were instructive in proportion to what they did not confirm. Baskerly's general account is not implausible. The offices, the duties, the character of the service, all consistent with a man who has read carefully. But Rawlings knew personally every English administrator of any seniority in Colombo during those years. The name Baskerly appears nowhere in his recollection, nor in the directory of colonial appointments which I subsequently consulted at the London Library. I set down my cup. Then he fabricated the colonial history entirely. It would appear so, though fabrication of that calibre requires material to work from. And that material must have come from somewhere close to the genuine article. Holmes rose and moved to the mantelpiece, where he stood turning over a small object I recognised as a fragment of ink-stained blotting paper, folded carefully into a square. This was retrieved from the waste bin beside desk 14 at Somerset House. I removed it during our visit while Fothergill was attending to Carberry. I've since been at some pains to develop what is written upon it. He handed it to me. The paper, when I unfolded it, bore several reversed impressions of handwritten text in the ordinary manner of blotting, the words reversed and faint but legible upon close examination. 2 lines in particular were clear enough to read. The first appeared to be a partial postal address in the Lambeth district. The second was a single phrase, written evidently with some firmness of hand, which read, "The ink must match precisely." I looked up at Holmes. "The instruction," said he, "some of a man engaged in the preparation of a document intended to sit alongside others of established date. The ink, you see, Watson, is the forger's perpetual anxiety. Modern ink in a record of 2 years ago is a risk that only the most meticulous preparation can reduce." That same afternoon we were joined at Baker Street by Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, who arrived in a state of satisfied energy that I knew from experience was not always a reliable indicator of genuine progress. Lestrade was a lean, dark-featured man of terrier-like tenacity, whose limitations Holmes privately regarded as considerable, but whose access to official resources he occasionally found it expedient to cultivate. "The matter is very nearly resolved, Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade, accepting a chair and refusing tea with a wave that suggested he was a man of affairs. "We have identified the most likely culprit, a junior clerk at the registry by the name of Hooper, Thomas Hooper, at 24 years of age, known to have incurred debts of some significance with a moneylender in Bermondsey. He had access to the general filing room on the evening in question, having remained late under the pretext of completing a backlog." "Has he been questioned?" Holmes asked. "At length. He denies everything, naturally, but the debts are real, and a man in debt with access to documents of value is not a combination one dismisses lightly." "No," said Holmes, "it is not. Tell me." "Lestrade, what use would young Hooper make of a probate packet once he had it?" Lestrade appeared momentarily arrested. "Why, he might hold it to ransom against the heir, I should think, demand payment for its return, or threaten to destroy it altogether, in which case the heir would be his victim, and the heir would have come forward to say so. Has Mr. Adrian Baskerly reported any such approach?" A brief silence followed. "He has not," Lestrade admitted. "Nor will he," said Holmes, in the tone of a man closing a door gently. "I do not say that Hooper is an honest man. His debts may well have made him susceptible to approaches of various kinds. But the disappearance of the Baskerly probate was not the work of a frightened junior clerk acting on improvised greed. It was the work of someone who understood the probate system in precise detail, who knew what the packet contained, and who required it to be absent for a specific and limited period of time." Lestrade looked at him steadily. "You have a theory, then?" "I have the beginnings of a certainty. I require 2 further days." Holmes leaned forward and fixed Lestrade with an expression of genuine earnestness that I saw seldom enough to remark upon. "I would ask you as a particular favour not to arrest young Hooper upon the present evidence. If you do, the real architect of this scheme will understand that the investigation is satisfied with a scapegoat, and will act accordingly." Lestrade was not a man who surrendered ground without negotiation, and he left Baker Street with the slightly compressed expression of one who has conceded more than he intended. Holmes watched the cab from the window with his hands clasped behind his back. "He will hold off for 48 hours, he said, more to himself than to me. That is sufficient. If I move quickly, he moved quickly." That evening, while I dined at my club, Holmes revisited the Somerset House registry, under a pretext I did not learn until afterward, and obtained from the archivist access to the probate ledgers for the preceding 3 years. He spent 4 hours with those volumes and a magnifying glass and a small portable balance he used for comparing ink densities, of which I had not previously known him to make use. When I called in Baker Street the following morning, I found him in excellent spirits, and the deal table occupied by a row of traced handwriting specimens laid out with the orderly precision of botanical samples. He had drawn careful lines beneath particular letter formations in each, and the markings bore a correspondence I could see plainly even without his guidance. "The ledger entry recording the Baskerly filing," said he, indicating the rightmost specimen, "Ray was made by a hand that writes the lowercase letter E with a distinctive backward flick at the close of the stroke. It appears in no other entry in that ledger dating before the month of February. It appears, however, in every entry made since that month." He placed his finger upon a second sheet. "It appears also here, in the letter from Adrian Baskerly to Carberry's firm, dated the 14th of March. He straightened and looked at me with quiet satisfaction. "We are confronted not with a dishonest clerk, Watson, but with a different clerk altogether. Chapter 4. Motives of Passion." Holmes's revelation ought, by the ordinary progress of an investigation, to have simplified matters considerably. Instead, it had the effect, not uncommon in his cases, of replacing one perplexity with a larger one. If the man behind the desk at Somerset House was not Samuel Pritchard, then Pritchard himself had been displaced, and the question of where he had gone and under what circumstances demanded an answer, before any further conclusions could be safely drawn. Holmes, however, was not yet prepared to pursue that line directly. He had, as he occasionally explained to me with the patient air of a chess master, describing his intentions to someone who plays only drafts, a sequence in mind, and he preferred to follow it. The following morning he proposed that we turn our attention to Sir Lionel Baskerly himself, and to the circumstances of his life at Wells in the period immediately preceding his death. "We have considered this matter almost entirely from the London end," Holmes remarked, as we took the early train from Paddington into Somerset. "The probate, the registry, the heir. But the foundation of the scheme, if it is the scheme I believe it to be, was constructed not in London but in the knowledge of one elderly man's domestic arrangements and family history. Someone understood Sir Lionel very well, and that understanding did not come from a consular report. Wells received us with the mild indifference of a cathedral town that has seen its share of legal complications and remains unimpressed by them. We had obtained from Carberry the address of Sir Lionel's former solicitor in the town, a Mr. Alderton, who received us at his office above a stationer's shop with the gravity of a man to whom death and its arrangements are the bread of professional life. Alderton confirmed the broad outline of the case as Carberry had presented it. Sir Lionel had been a man of method and retirement, little given to society, absorbed in his antiquities and in the administration of his small estate, of which he had been a careful and unpretentious steward. His will had been drawn up some 8 years previously and amended only once, by the codicil acknowledging the supposed nephew. Alderton had witnessed the signature upon that codicil himself, and his account of the occasion gave me my first real pause in the investigation. Sir Lionel was not, at that point, a well man, said Alderton carefully. He had been declining for some months. I will not say that his mind was impaired, because I have no grounds for that assertion. But he was weaker than I had known him, and more susceptible to influence than his character and health would have admitted. The young man, Baskerly, had visited him 3 times in the weeks prior to the codicil. Sir Lionel spoke of him with evident warmth. Did Sir Lionel ever speak of his brother George? Holmes asked. Once, when I raised the question directly upon preparing the original will, he told me that George had gone abroad young, that there had been an estrangement over money, and that he neither expected nor desired any further contact. He did not suggest that George had married, or indeed that he knew anything definite of George's subsequent history. And yet when a young man appeared claiming to be George's son, Sir Lionel accepted him. Alderton spread his hands in a gesture of professional helplessness. An old man, alone, without heirs, approached by someone who presented himself with warmth and a certain quantity of family detail. It is not, I am afraid, a circumstance unprecedented in my experience. We learned one further thing from Alderton that Holmes received with visible interest. In the months before Sir Lionel's final decline, there had been in his household a housekeeper of some years' standing, a Mrs. Eliza Prentice, who had believed herself mentioned in an earlier draft of the will. She had, upon learning that no such bequest appeared in the final instrument, expressed herself with considerable feeling to several persons in the town. She had also, Alderton understood, made an unannounced visit to London in the week before the probate filing, a fact that had come to his attention through a remark made by Sir Lionel's manservant. Holmes made no immediate comment upon this intelligence, and I was left to walk with it during our return to the town's single decent hotel, where we had engaged rooms for the night. Mrs. Prentice's grievance was exactly the kind of emotional motive that would satisfy a conventional investigation, and I found myself constructing around it the outline of a theory: a wronged woman, access to private family papers, knowledge of Sir Lionel's habits, a visit to London coinciding precisely with the disappearance. It assembled itself with a suspicious ease. Holmes listened to my exposition over supper with the courteous attention he reserved for arguments he intended to dismantle. "It is a very satisfying construction," he said, "and it accounts for the emotional fact perfectly. A woman of injured feeling, intimate knowledge of the household, the London visit. The only difficulty is that it does not account for the ink." I waited. Mrs. Prentice, whatever her grievances, did not compose the forged genealogical affidavit, using an ink formula carefully matched to a document of 2 years previous. She did not impersonate a registry clerk of 15 years' standing. She did not acquire, presumably through some previous legal employment, a precise knowledge of probate procedure sufficient to manipulate the filing system without triggering its safeguards. Holmes refilled his glass. She is, I do not doubt, genuinely aggrieved. Aggrieved persons make excellent distractions. In my experience, they are sometimes employed as such. The word stopped me. You think she was used? I think her visit to Somerset House was known in advance, by someone who understood that it would provide a secondary explanation for the disappearance. Should the primary scheme come under scrutiny, police theories favour the obvious and the emotional. A resentful housekeeper is far more comfortable than a forger of considerable sophistication. He set down his glass. I also think that the same person who constructed the identity of Adrian Baskerly had access, at some earlier period, to Sir Lionel's private papers. Family letters, perhaps. The kind of correspondence that would establish names, dates. The character of the estrangement with George. Without that material, the impersonation could not have been sustained through 3 personal visits to a man who had known the family from the inside. Someone who had been in the house, I said, or who had access to someone who had been in the house. We were silent for a moment. Through the window of the hotel dining room, the last of the spring evening was fading over the cathedral tower, and the town was settling into its customary quiet. "There is another matter," Holmes said presently, as though offering an afterthought, though I had long since learned that his afterthoughts were rarely accidental. "I telegraphed this afternoon to a man I know at the Ceylon Civil Service Records Office in London. I asked him to search the employment registers for the name Baskerly between the years 1883 and 1890. He replied within 2 hours. He produced a folded telegraph form from his breast pocket and laid it upon the table without unfolding it. The name does not appear. That we already suspected. Quite so. But I also asked him to search for any employee who left the service under irregular circumstances during the same period, whose stated reason for departure involved personal or family matters in England." He paused. He found one such entry. A clerk of the second grade who resigned in the spring of 1889, giving as his reason the illness of an elderly relative. He had served in the administrative offices in Colombo for 4 years. Holmes unfolded the telegraph and passed it across to me. The name recorded in the Colonial Employment Register was not Baskerly. It was a name I did not recognise. But beneath it, in the terse phrasing of official correspondence, the clerk's description had been preserved. Lean build, albeit light complexion, a scar upon the left jaw from a childhood injury. I looked up at Holmes. "Adrian Baskerly," I said. "The man who came to Wells and charmed a dying magistrate into signing a codicil," Holmes replied. "He was in Ceylon, Watson, as he claimed. He simply was not there as Baskerly." Chapter 5, Sincerity and Performance. We returned to London on the morning train, and I spent the journey watching the Somerset levels flatten gradually into the outer reaches of the city, with a sense that the investigation had reached one of those points of uneasy equilibrium that characterise Holmes's cases at their mid-stage. We possessed a considerable quantity of suggestive material. We knew that the man calling himself Adrian Baskerly had indeed served in Ceylon, though under a different name and identity. We knew that the clerk behind desk 14 at Somerset House was almost certainly not Samuel Pritchard. We knew that the probate packet had been removed and Holmes was confident tampered with before its anticipated return. What we did not yet know was the mechanism by which these separate elements had been coordinated, nor by what means a man of colonial clerical background had acquired so precise and specialised a knowledge of English probate procedure as to subvert it without, and until Holmes's intervention, raising any alarm whatsoever. Holmes occupied himself on the journey with a small notebook, writing nothing so far as I could observe, but turning it in his hands with the inward abstraction of a man conducting an argument silently with himself. He spoke only once before we reached Paddington, and then briefly. "We must see Baskerly again," he said, "this afternoon, if Carberry can arrange it." Carberry could, and did. By 3 o'clock the 4 of us were assembled in the solicitor's own rooms at Lincoln's Inn, a panelled, book-lined chamber that smelled agreeably of beeswax and old leather, and which conferred upon its proceedings an atmosphere of professional sobriety entirely suited to Holmes's purpose. Adrian Baskerly arrived punctually, dressed with the same quiet correctness I had observed at Somerset House, and greeted Carberry with the easy manner of a man who has nothing particular to conceal and considers the inconvenience of these consultations a reasonable price for the eventual resolution of his affairs. I watched him with renewed attention, applying now the understanding that everything I saw was the product of deliberate construction rather than authentic character. It is a curious exercise, observing a performance when one knows it to be a performance, for the knowledge does not diminish the craft, and Baskerly's craft was considerable. His concern was present but not excessive. His patience carried within it a faint suggestion of strain, natural enough in a man whose inheritance has been held in legal suspension for weeks, but never tipping into impatience. When Carberry mentioned, in passing, the failure to locate any official record of his colonial service under the name Baskerly, the man's expression registered surprise, then thoughtfulness, then a willingness to assist that was performed so fluently as to be almost invisible as performance at all. "There may have been an administrative irregularity," he said. "The records at Colombo were not always maintained with perfect consistency. I can provide correspondence if it would assist." "I am certain you can," said Holmes pleasantly. His tone was light, but Baskerly glanced at him with a precision that was briefly, almost imperceptibly, something other than the gentlemanly bewilderment he had displayed until that moment. It was the flicker of a man recalibrating. It lasted perhaps a second, and then the composed exterior was perfectly restored. Holmes led him through a careful conversation about Ceylon, and I observed, as Holmes had instructed me to do on our previous meeting, the timing of the responses. On broad questions, the answers came freely and with apparent spontaneity. But on 3 occasions Holmes introduced, with the casualness of a man making idle conversation, specific and obscure references to colonial life, the name of a particular shipping agent who had operated out of Colombo in the late 80s, a local festival observed in a specific district, the argot used among the lower administrative grades for a particular category of official correspondence. Each time, Baskerly's answer came after a pause so small that I doubt Carberry noticed it. A hesitation of perhaps 2 seconds that in ordinary conversation would pass without remark. In the context of a man drawing upon his own lived experience, it was 2 seconds too many. He answered correctly on 2 of the 3 occasions. On the third, regarding the shipping agent, he gave a name that was close to accurate but not quite right, in the manner of someone working from a written source rather than personal memory. Holmes received the answer with a nod of mild interest and moved immediately to another subject, so smoothly that Baskerly had no opportunity to correct himself or gauge the significance of the error. After 20 minutes, Holmes appeared to lose interest in the colonial history and turned instead to Sir Lionel. Here the performance changed register. Baskerly spoke of his uncle with a warmth that was, by any external measure, entirely convincing. He recalled small details of the old man's habits, his preference for a particular chair by the library window, his habit of reading aloud to himself when he thought no one could hear, his pride in a set of Roman fibulae acquired from an estate sale in Dorset. The details were specific enough to have required real source material, a housekeeper's account perhaps, or private letters read with the attention of a man preparing a role rather than receiving a confidence. Holmes listened with his eyes half closed and the expression of a man enjoying a fire on a winter evening. When Baskerly had gone, Carberry turned to Holmes with the barely suppressed anxiety of a man who has been present at something he cannot fully interpret. "Well," he said. "He's very good," said Holmes, opening his eyes. "The emotional register is particularly well managed. Most people performing grief will produce it either too early or in response to a prompt. Baskerly produces it precisely when a genuinely bereaved man would, which suggests he has studied genuinely bereaved men with some care." He stood and reached for his hat. "The detail about the Roman fibulae is interesting. It appears in Sir Lionel's correspondence with a dealer in Bath, correspondence which was in the possession of the estate solicitor and would not have been accessible to a casual acquaintance. It was not in any published account of Sir Lionel's collection. Then someone provided it to him," I said. "Someone with access to private papers did so, yes, and did so some time in advance of the first visit to Wells, because the kind of domestic intimacy Baskerly displayed this afternoon is not acquired in a single briefing. It is rehearsed." Holmes buttoned his coat. "I have one further inquiry to make this evening, and if it yields what I expect, I shall have a rather complete picture of the matter. Watson, I would be grateful if you could present yourself at Baker Street tomorrow morning at 9, and I would suggest, Carberry, that you inform no one of the substance of this afternoon's conversation, not even Mr. Baskerly, should he contact you with any further expressions of cooperative goodwill." Carberry blinked. "You expect him to do so? A man who has invested this amount of careful preparation in his enterprise does not abandon it, because 2 questions were asked about a shipping agent. He will wish to know what we know. He will make inquiries through whatever channels he has arranged for that purpose." Holmes paused at the door. "The performance continues, Mr. Carberry, until the final curtain. That is the nature of the professional." I walked with Holmes as far as the corner of Chancery Lane, where he hailed a cab with the rapid economy of a man who has already calculated his destination to the minute. I asked him where he was going. "To obtain the older samples of Pritchard's handwriting from the registry archive," he said, settling into the cab, "and to compare them with the entries made since February. I have formed a conclusion, Watson, but I require the confirmation that only primary evidence can honestly provide. I will not accuse a man upon inference alone when the document is obtainable." He was gone before I could reply, the cab swallowed almost immediately into the afternoon traffic of the Strand. I stood for a moment on the pavement, turning over the afternoon's events, and found myself thinking not of Baskerly's accomplished performance, nor of the registry's subverted machinery, but of that single minute hesitation before the name of the shipping agent, the small unmistakable interval between a man reaching for genuine experience and finding only paper in its place. Holmes's conclusion, whatever it was close now. I could feel it in the particular quality of his attention, the way it had sharpened and contracted around its object like a lens brought slowly into focus. Chapter 6. The False Clerk. Holmes was already at the breakfast table when I arrived at Baker Street the following morning, which was itself unusual enough to put me on notice that the night had been productive. He was not a man who rose early without reason, and the reason, when it existed, was invariably that he had not yet been to bed. The signs were familiar to me after so many years. The ashtray beside his chair had been emptied and refilled twice over. The chemical smell that clung to his cuffs indicated recent work at the bench in the corner, and there was about his entire bearing the taut, forward-leaning quality of a mind that has passed beyond fatigue into the cleaner territory that lies on its far side. He pushed a sheet of paper toward me as I sat down, before I'd spoken a word or removed my coat. The sheet bore 2 columns of handwriting specimens, each line carefully labelled in Holmes's own small script. The left column was headed Simply Earlier, and contained entries dated across a span of several years, were drawn from the registry ledgers Holmes had obtained the previous evening. The right column bore the heading Recent, and contained entries from February of the current year onward. Even to my unpractised eye the difference was apparent. The earlier hand was assured and rhythmic, with the particular fluency of a man who has copied documents by the thousand, and whose pen has long since ceased to require the active direction of the conscious mind. The recent hand was careful, accurate, and, in the aggregate, convincing, but it was the accuracy of deliberate imitation rather than of habit, and in several of the letter formations it departed from the earlier standard in ways so small that only extended comparison revealed them. "The lower case R," said Holmes without preamble, "and the capital B, both consistent within each column, both distinct between them. A forger attempting to replicate a hand will study his model and reproduce its most prominent characteristics with great fidelity. The subtler, less conscious habits of formation, the ones a man does not notice in his own writing, because they have been automatic for 20 years, those he invariably misses." He tapped the sheet. "The man behind that desk has studied Pritchard's hand with intelligence and thoroughness, but he is not Pritchard. And this is now beyond question," I said. "It has been beyond my own question since the blotting paper," Holmes replied, with a precise honesty that was one of his less comfortable qualities. "It is now beyond the question of any independent examiner. There is a sufficient body of primary evidence to demonstrate the impersonation to any tribunal in England." He poured tea and, in a gesture of concession to ordinary human appetite, consumed 2 pieces of toast in rapid succession. "There remains the question of Pritchard himself. I have a strong suspicion of where he is, and I intend to resolve it this morning. I should value your company." The address he produced from his notebook was in Southwark, a district of the borough whose streets, while not without their own grim vitality, were not of the kind that one associated with a clerk of 15 years' metropolitan standing. We crossed the river in a cab that deposited us before a row of narrow terraced houses in a street running parallel to the river, close enough that the air carried the perpetual damp exhalation of the Thames. The houses were respectable in the subdued manner of a neighbourhood that has come down from something better, without quite accepting the fact, their windows clean, their steps swept, their general appearance suggesting the maintenance of standards under conditions that made standards effortful. The house Holmes sought was the third in the row. We were admitted by a landlady of businesslike aspect who showed no surprise at our arrival, which suggested Holmes had sent word ahead by some means he had not troubled to mention. She led us up a narrow stair and knocked at a door on the first floor with the single sufficient rap of a woman who expects her knocks to be answered. The man within was thin, pale in the manner of someone who has been confined indoors for longer than is good for them, and wore the look of prolonged diminishment that illness and helplessness leave upon a face that has formerly been competent and self-reliant. He was perhaps 45, with the sandy receding hair and broad forehead I had attributed to the man at desk 14. The eyes, however, were different, steadier and less guarded. The eyes of a man with nothing to conceal. "Mr. Pritchard," said Holmes, drawing a chair to the bedside with the quiet ease of a physician making a familiar call. "I am Sherlock Holmes. I believe you have been expecting someone to find you, and I am sorry it has taken as long as it has." Pritchard looked at us both for a moment, and the expression that crossed his face was not quite relief, and not quite fear, but something between the two that resolved, after a brief struggle, into the more dignified of its components. "I had begun to think no one would," he said. His voice was stronger than his appearance had led me to anticipate. The account he gave was delivered in the measured, slightly deliberate manner of a man who has rehearsed it many times in his own mind, against the possibility of exactly this occasion. In late January he had responded to an advertisement in the Morning Post, a notice inviting persons of reliable character to consult upon an investment opportunity of a confidential nature, the language being precisely calculated, as Holmes observed quietly, as to attract the careful and the modestly ambitious rather than the reckless. He had attended a meeting at an address in Holborn, met a plausible man of legal bearing, been offered a glass of Madeira that he now understood to have contained some preparation that had rendered him insensible, and awakened 2 days later in this very room, his head disordered, his limbs uncooperative, and a note upon the bedside table informing him that he had been taken suddenly ill, and that arrangements had been made for his convalescence at the expense of a philanthropic fund with which his employer had no connection. "They were thorough," said Pritchard, with a professional's reluctant admiration. "A doctor attended, a real doctor so far as I could determine, a man who told me I had suffered a nervous collapse of some severity and must rest for a minimum of 2 months. The landlady received payment in advance. There were letters sent in my name to the registry. I have no knowledge of their exact content, and I was given to understand that my position was secure and that I would be reinstated when I had recovered." He paused. I did not feel able to contradict any of it. I was weak. I had no money beyond the small sum in my pocket on the night I had attended the meeting, and I could not be certain, in my earliest weeks here, that what they told me about my own condition was not true. "You were not certain you had not simply been ill," I said, with the sympathy of a medical man for the particular confusion of a mind recovering from chemical interference. "No, I was not certain. It is a most disorienting thing, Dr. Watson, to distrust one's own recollections." He straightened slightly. "But in recent weeks I have recovered sufficiently to be quite certain of what occurred. I have been a prisoner of my own respectability. Had I gone to the authorities in the condition they engineered, appearing confused, unknown at my own address with letters in my name explaining my absence, I should have appeared either deranged or dishonest, perhaps both." Holmes nodded with a gravity that contained in it the particular quality of genuine respect. "It was a well-constructed trap, Mr. Pritchard, and you are not the first capable man to have been caught in it. But its time has run its course." He rose and moved to the window, looking down into the street below with the alert stillness of a man confirming an arrangement. "I have taken the liberty of asking Inspector Lestrade to make himself available this afternoon. Not for you," he added, turning back with a slight smile, "for the man who has been sitting at your desk." "What is it that they wanted?" Pritchard asked. "I have lain here wondering for weeks." Holmes considered the question for a moment with his head slightly to one side. "They wanted the probate not to disappear, Mr. Pritchard. That is the thing one must understand about this case." He took up his hat. "They wanted it to vanish only long enough to be made into something it was not. The theft was the surgery, the return was the cure, and no one, until now, understood that there had been an operation at all." Chapter 7. The Convenient Discovery. The telegram arrived at Baker Street the following morning before Holmes and I had finished our coffee. He read it standing, having intercepted Mrs. Hudson upon the stair with the impatience of a man who has been anticipating a particular message and finds waiting upon its arrival a physical inconvenience. His expression as he read it was not of surprise, but of the particular satisfaction of a prediction confirmed, which in Holmes's case was an expression so frequent as to be almost habitual, and yet never quite lost the quality of genuine pleasure. He handed the telegram to me without comment. It was from Carberry, and it read: probate packet discovered this morning among misfiled bundle in secondary archive. Registrar Fothergill notified. Matter apparently resolved. Baskerly informed. Please advise. I set it down. It has been returned. As I expected it would be, said Holmes. In dropping into his armchair and filling his pipe with a methodical deliberateness that indicated sustained thought rather than relaxation. The impersonation of Pritchard could not continue indefinitely. Every day the false clerk remained at that desk was a day on which discovery became more probable, and with Lestrade now in partial possession of the facts, the risk had increased to a point where continuance was more dangerous than withdrawal. The packet has served its purpose. It can safely reappear. Then Baskerly's inheritance is secure. That, said Holmes, with a slight upward inflection that transformed the observation into something considerably more complex, is precisely what someone wishes us to conclude. We went to Somerset House before noon. Fothergill received us with the relieved expansiveness of a man from whom a considerable professional weight has been lifted, and displayed the recovered packet with the quiet pride of a registrar whose registry has, in the official version of events, suffered nothing worse than a filing irregularity. The packet had been discovered, he explained, by his own hand, during a routine examination of a secondary archive in which documents awaiting transcription were temporarily stored. It had apparently been misrouted during a period of unusual pressure upon the clerical staff. The matter was entirely consistent with an administrative error of the most innocent kind, and he trusted that the unfortunate speculation regarding deliberate removal could now be laid conclusively to rest. Holmes listened to this account with the expression of polite attention he reserved for explanations he considered entirely beside the point. When Fothergill had finished, Holmes asked, with the mild tone of a man raising a procedural matter, whether he might examine the packet. Fothergill hesitated for a fraction of a second. "The documents are in order," he said. "I have myself verified their completeness." "No doubt," said Holmes. "Nevertheless." The packet was produced. Holmes carried it to the reading table by the window and spent some 15 minutes with it, turning the documents in the strong light, examining the paper and the seals and the signatures with the lens, and occasionally holding a page at an angle that allowed him to study the surface of the paper rather than the writing upon it. I watched from a discreet distance, having long since learned that interruption during these examinations was neither welcome nor productive. Fothergill stood by his desk with the controlled discomfort of a man who has been vindicated and yet somehow suspects the vindication is being assessed for flaws. Holmes set the lens down at last and returned the packet to its cover with the careful movements of someone handling material whose significance he intends to preserve. He thanked Fothergill with genuine courtesy, made a request to retain the daybook for a further period of examination, and said nothing of consequence until we were in the cab heading back toward Baker Street, at which point he turned to me with the concentrated attention of a man who's been holding a conclusion in reserve and finds the moment of its release has arrived. "The will is genuine," he said. "The death certificate is genuine. The witness signatures upon the codicil are genuine, which is to say they were placed there by the actual witnesses at the actual time, and any attempt to challenge them on grounds of forgery would fail. The notarial seal is authentic. The packet, as a physical collection of documents, is unimpeachable. Then what has been altered? One document only. The genealogical affidavit." He settled back. "It is a single sheet, sworn before a commissioner of oaths, identifying Adrian Baskerly as the legitimate son of George Henry Baskerly, younger brother of Sir Lionel. The paper is correct for the date. The commissioner's seal is genuine. The signature of the deponent is genuine." I frowned. "Then how has it been tampered with?" "It has not been tampered with, Watson. It has been replaced." He drew from his coat pocket a small folded paper, which I recognised as the notes he had made during his examination. The affidavit bears a fold pattern inconsistent with the other documents in the packet. Every other sheet in that packet has been folded in thirds for filing, a standard registry fold producing a crease at 1/3 and 2/3 of the sheet. The affidavit has been folded in quarters, the habit of a man who carries documents in a breast pocket rather than a document wallet. A small thing, But the fold was made before filing, not after, which means this sheet was not in the packet when the other documents were first assembled. It was inserted during the period of disappearance. Prepared in advance, inserted during the removal, and the packet returned with its new contents undisturbed. The Commissioner of Oaths, whose seal appears on the affidavit, I shall be paying him a visit tomorrow, is almost certainly a real official who was presented with a plausible deponent and a plausible set of supporting documents, and saw no reason for suspicion. The deponent who swore the affidavit before him may have been Baskerly himself, or another confederate, but the Commissioner's role in the fraud was entirely innocent. The cab swung into Baker Street, and Holmes descended with the rapid step of a man with several tasks arranged in sequence. I followed him up the stairs into the sitting room, where he went directly to the desk and began writing a series of notes, the first addressed to Lestrade, the second to Carberry, and the third, which he sealed without showing me, to an address in the city that I caught a partial glimpse of before he folded it. "Holmes," I said as he wrote, "you mentioned that the packet's return was anticipated, but if the scheme was as carefully laid as it appears, why return the packet at all? Why not allow the legal uncertainty to persist until some other means of securing the inheritance were found?" He paused in his writing and considered the question with the respect it deserved. "Because uncertainty is itself a danger," he said. "A missing probate invites investigation. A found probate, apparently complete and officially verified, invites nothing but relief. Our man understands that the safest position is not absence of evidence, but presence of evidence that appears above reproach." He returned to his letter. "The machinery of English law, Watson, is a great deal easier to use than it is to fight. He has not attacked it. He has operated it." He finished his letters and dispatched them by Mrs. Hudson, who accepted the commission with the composure of a woman long accustomed to serving as the hub of a private intelligence network. Holmes then stood before the fire for several minutes in the attitude of concentrated stillness that in another man I might have called prayer, and then turned with the decisive quality of someone who has concluded an internal deliberation. "I must visit the packet once more," he said, "and I must also visit the office of that Commissioner of Oaths. But I will tell you now, Watson, what I expect to find, so that you may judge for yourself the completeness of the case when the evidence confirms it." He looked at me with the direct attention he brought to conclusions he considered important. The genealogical affidavit is not merely forged in its content. It relies entirely upon secondary testimony, hearsay witnesses attesting to what they were told of Baskerly's parentage rather than primary evidence of birth or baptism. Under ordinary scrutiny it would appear unusual. Under no scrutiny at all, which is what its author intended, it appears sufficient. He crossed to the window and looked down into Baker Street, where the afternoon had brought out the usual commerce of the street, in its habitual indifference to the transactions occurring above it. "The documents have been returned to perfectly," he said quietly. "A packet genuinely misfiled for 3 weeks would carry the evidence of its misfiling. Dust, displacement, the slight disorder of papers shifted repeatedly by hands looking for other things. These documents are undisturbed." He turned from the window. "Someone placed them there this morning. They have not been in that archive for more than a few hours." Chapter 8. The Quiet Confirmation. There are moments in Holmes's investigations when the accumulation of separate threads reaches a density at which the overall pattern becomes suddenly and completely visible, not through the addition of any single dramatic discovery, but through the quiet convergence of material that has been gathering for days. I had witnessed this phenomenon sufficiently often to recognize its approach, and as Holmes set out the following morning on his visit to the Commissioner of the Oaths, I had the strong sense that we were very close to that point. The architecture of the scheme was now largely apparent. What remained was the mortar that would hold it permanently in place. Holmes returned to Baker Street at 2:30 in the afternoon carrying a small notebook, and the expression of a man whose hypothesis has been confirmed with a thoroughness that affords him no particular pleasure. He laid his hat and coat aside, filled a pipe, and sat for several minutes in silence before offering any account of the morning. "The Commissioner," he said at length, "is a Mr. Septimus Waugh, with offices in Tokenhouse Yard. He is a perfectly respectable official of 20 years' standing, meticulous in his habits, and entirely innocent of any conscious participation in the fraud." He recalled the affidavit readily enough. It was sworn before him on the 3rd of February by a gentleman who presented himself as a retired military man named Collingwood, who claimed personal acquaintance with the Baskerly family extending back 30 years and attested upon that basis to the parentage of Adrian Baskerly. And Collingwood does not appear to exist beyond the occasion of that single sworn statement. I have made sufficient inquiries to satisfy myself on that point. Holmes drew upon his pipe. Waugh accepted him at face value, which is not a criticism of Waugh. The man presented himself with the confidence and particularity of someone telling the truth, provided 2 character references of the kind that are verifiable in principle and rarely verified in practice, and conducted the entire transaction with an unhurried ease that Waugh described as entirely reassuring. He paused. He also described the man, and the description is of some interest. Medium height, spare build, light complexion, a faint scar upon the left jaw. I was silent for a moment. The colonial clerk from the Ceylon Register. The same man. The description matches precisely. Holmes set down his pipe and reached for the stack of documents he had accumulated over the preceding days, arranging them across the table in the deliberate sequence of a man who is constructing a final argument rather than reviewing existing knowledge. He is thorough, Watson. The affidavit had to be sworn by someone, and it could not be sworn by Baskerly himself without creating a document in which the beneficiary effectively attests to his own entitlement, which even a cursory legal examination would find irregular. So a separate identity was required for that single purpose. Collingwood served that purpose and was retired. And the parish records, I asked. The outline of this case always seemed to me to rest ultimately upon them. A genuine nephew would be baptised, confirmed, recorded in the registers of whatever parish the brother George inhabited. Holmes had anticipated the question. From the lower portion of the arranged documents he withdrew a sheet covered in his own close handwriting, which proved upon examination to be a précis of correspondence he had conducted over the preceding days with the Registrar General's office and with 2 separate parish registries in the West Country. George Henry Baskerly, younger brother of Sir Lionel, had indeed existed. He had been born in 1841 in the parish of Shepton Mallet, had briefly attended a school in Bristol, and had, at the age of 19, departed for the continent following a documented quarrel with his family over the matter of an unpaid debt to a local tradesman. Beyond that point the English records were silent. There was no record of his marriage in any English parish register. There was no record of issue. There was. In the colonial records of those territories Holmes had consulted, no trace of him at all. More conclusively still, Holmes had obtained through a contact at the Foreign Office a summary of a report compiled by a consular official in Lisbon in the year 1871, responding to an inquiry from Sir Lionel's own solicitor at that time, who had apparently made efforts to locate the younger brother for purposes of a family financial settlement. The consular report stated, "I am with the sparse finality of official correspondence that George Henry Baskerly had died in Lisbon in the spring of 1868, unmarried and without known issue." Sir Lionel knew this, I said, reading the summary with a growing sense of the coldness of the scheme entire. Or at least his solicitor did 20 years ago. The knowledge was in the file. Whether Sir Lionel consulted the file in his final months, declining and susceptible as Alderton described him, is another matter. A man presented with warmth and with plausible family details, and with the very human desire for connection at the end of a solitary life, is not always disposed to interrogate his own hope. Holmes's voice carried no judgment in it, only the measured acknowledgment of a fact about human nature that he had encountered before. The scheme was constructed upon that susceptibility as deliberately as it was constructed upon the gap in the clerical records. I sat with the weight of it for a moment. £40,000, an old man's loneliness, a manufactured nephew, and the patient impersonation of a registry clerk. The audacity of the enterprise was not of the violent or impulsive kind that produces its own evidence, but of the architectural kind, planned far in advance and built to stand up to the ordinary scrutiny that satisfied ordinary institutions. "There is one remaining element," Holmes said. "I'm moving to the mantelpiece and looking down at the arranged documents from that slight distance, as one steps back from a painting to judge its composition entire. The connection between the false clerk and Baskerly. We know, from the handwriting comparison, that the man at desk 14 and the man presenting himself as Adrian Baskerly produced documents with the same distinctive letter formations. We know, from the Salon Register, that a clerk of that service left under circumstances consistent with Baskerly's described history. We know from War that the deponent of the genealogical affidavit bore the same physical description as the colonial entry." "They are the same man," I said. "They are the same man," Holmes confirmed, "playing two roles in the same theatre, entering and exiting through different doors. As Baskerly, he built the legal identity and secured the codicil. As the false Pritchard, he controlled the filing of the identity's official foundation and ensured that the inserted affidavit would never face the scrutiny of a genuinely experienced registry clerk." He turned from the mantelpiece. The one role required charm and patience. The other required technical knowledge and impersonation. Both required nerve of a very particular cold-blooded kind. He crossed then to the window, standing with his back to me for several seconds. When he spoke again, his voice had the quiet of a man delivering a conclusion he has resisted as long as evidence permitted. "The ink upon the inserted affidavit and the ink of the ledger entries made by the false clerk are of the same formula. I confirmed this last night. It is an unusual preparation containing a proportion of iron gall combined with a trace of gamboge that gives the dried ink a very slightly warm tone rather than the flat black of the standard commercial product." He turned. "It is, so far as I have been able to determine, prepared to order by a single stationer in Clerkenwell who sells to perhaps 30 regular customers. I have the name of every customer who made a purchase in the past 6 months." He crossed to the desk and produced a single sheet from beneath the document arrangement, placing it before me with the careful gesture of a man offering evidence rather than drama. One name on the list had been underlined in Holmes's hand. It was not the name Baskerly. It was not the name Collingwood. It was a third name, a name I had not encountered in the course of the investigation until that moment, and its appearance there, at the convergence of every line of inquiry Holmes had pursued, produced in me the particular chill of a thing that has been logically inevitable from the beginning, but that strikes, upon its revelation, with the force of genuine surprise. "Tomorrow," said Holmes quietly, "we shall have him." Chapter 9. The Constructed Heir. Holmes sent 3 telegrams that evening and received 2 replies before 10 o'clock. He shared their contents with me only in summary, confirming that Lestrade had been engaged and would present himself at Baker Street by 9 the following morning, and that Carberry had agreed, with a solicitor's careful anxiety, to arrange the attendance of Adrian Baskerly at his Lincoln's Inn rooms, under the pretext of a further consultation regarding the recovered probate. The third telegram, and the identity of its recipient, Holmes did not disclose, and I had sufficient experience of his methods to understand that inquiry upon that point would be premature. Lestrade arrived punctually, which was characteristic of him, and in a state of barely suppressed impatience, which was equally so. He had been holding Thomas Hooper on the thinnest of pretexts for the better part of a week. Him and the strain of conducting an official investigation on the leash of another man's timetable had worn upon him visibly. Holmes received him with a courtesy that contained within it a precise quantity of appeasement, offered him coffee, and spent 20 minutes laying before him, in careful and fully evident sequence, the complete architecture of the scheme. Lestrade listened with the disciplined attention of a man who has learned, through long and occasionally humbling experience, that Holmes's conclusions are best received without interruption. His expression passed through several stages during the recitation, from scepticism through reluctant acknowledgment to, at the account of the false Pritchard and the drugged Madeira, something approaching genuine astonishment. When Holmes had finished, Lestrade was quiet for a moment. "One man," he said, "playing the clerk and the heir both. Throughout the entire period of the scheme, yes. He took the convalescent leave in his capacity as the false Pritchard, in order to insert the genealogical affidavit and return the packet, during which interval he was necessarily unavailable at the desk. The brief absence, attributed to ill health, created no suspicion in a department accustomed to regarding him as a trusted professional." Holmes set down his cup. The roles did not overlap, which was essential. At no point was Adrian Baskerly required to be present in a room where Samuel Pritchard's replacement might also be expected to appear. "The stationer's ink," said Lestrade, studying the list Holmes had provided. "This name, you are certain?" "I am certain of the evidence. Its interpretation I will leave to the scene itself, which is the only honest approach." Holmes stood, straightening his coat with the brief, decisive movement of a man completing a preparation. "Shall we go to Lincoln's Inn?" The four of us went in 2 cabs, Holmes and I in the first, Lestrade and a constable of reliable discretion in the second, with the arrangement that Lestrade would wait below in Carberry's entrance hall until Holmes sent word. It was a cool, bright morning, the kind that London produces occasionally in late spring as if in acknowledgement of an obligation, and the legal quarter through which we passed carried its usual atmosphere of contained industry. Clerks moving between chambers with folders under their arms, barristers in conversation on steps, the whole machinery of English jurisprudence operating in its habitual register of unhurried authority. Carberry was waiting in his room with the composure of a man who has passed a difficult night maintaining it. Adrian Baskerly arrived 8 minutes after us, punctual and well presented, and with the settled manner of a man who has received news of the probate's recovery and considers the matter as good as concluded. He greeted Carberry with the quiet ease of an established professional relationship, acknowledged Holmes and myself with a nod of polite recognition, and took the chair indicated without any particular alteration of his expression. Holmes allowed the opening pleasantries to run their brief course before he spoke. When he did, his voice was entirely conversational, without the theatrical quality that a lesser man might have brought to the occasion. "I should like to show you something, Mr. Baskerly," he said, placing before him on Carberry's desk the handwriting comparison he had prepared. The left column contains entries from the Somerset House probate ledger made over a period of 12 years. The right column contains entries made from February of this year onward. I wonder if you would care to observe the formation of the lowercase letter r in each column, and tell me whether you find them consistent." Baskerly looked at the sheet. He looked at it for perhaps 5 seconds, and during those 5 seconds the performance that had been so accomplished through every previous encounter underwent a change so minute that I doubt Carberry observed it at all, a slight settling, a fractional decrease in the animation of the face, as though a very finely balanced mechanism had registered a shock and was compensating for it. "I am not a handwriting expert," said he. "I do not see what this has to do with my inheritance." "Nor am I an expert," Holmes replied, with perfect amiability. "I am merely an observer. Let me show you something further." He placed beside the handwriting sheet the traced specimens from Baskerly's own letters to Carberry. The same letter formation, you will notice, appears in your own correspondence. The backward flick at the close of the stroke. It is quite individual, he paused. As individual as the ink in which both the ledger entries and your letters were written, which I have confirmed was prepared by a stationer in Clerkenwell to whom a customer of your description made several purchases between November and March. The room was very quiet. Outside, a carriage passed in the lane below. Furthermore, Holmes continued, without altering his pace or his tone, the Commissioner of Oaths who witnessed the genealogical affidavit now residing in the recovered probate packet describes his deponent as a man of medium height, spare build, light complexion, and bearing a scar upon the left jaw. He looked directly at Baskerly. The scar is faint, but it's visible in this light, just below the line of the jaw on the left side. Baskerly's hand moved involuntarily and immediately corrected toward that part of his face. It was the smallest of movements, them instinctive and brief, and its very brevity was more conclusive than any admission. Holmes placed before him one final document, the précis of the Ceylon Employment Register, showing the unnamed clerk who had departed in 1889. You served in the administrative offices at Colombo for 4 years. It was there, I believe, that you first encountered the records of Sir Lionel Baskerly's brother, whose existence and whose estrangement from the family you learned through consular or colonial correspondence. A man in a clerical position in those offices would have had access to exactly the category of family communication that passes through official channels when an English resident requires assistance in tracing relatives abroad. He folded his hands. You constructed the identity of Adrian Baskerly at your leisure, over several years. And when Sir Lionel's health declined, you introduced yourself into his life through a letter calculated to appeal to precisely the loneliness and the family feeling that his manner of living had made inevitable. Baskerly said nothing. He sat with the stillness of a man who has run a very long race, and has, at its conclusion, nothing left to spend on further performance. Holmes continued with the same measured evenness. The impersonation of Pritchard required a period of observation sufficient to replicate his professional habits, his appearance, and his handwriting to a standard that would satisfy colleagues who saw him daily. That you achieved this argues a patience and a capacity for sustained deception that I find, if I am candid, professionally remarkable. He leaned forward slightly. You removed the probate packet on the second day of your tenure at the desk. You had prepared the genealogical affidavit in advance, sworn by yourself in the identity of Collingwood before a commissioner you selected for his distance from the matter. You inserted the affidavit, matched the ink, matched the paper, returned the packet, and arranged for its discovery in circumstances that pointed toward administrative error rather than deliberate interference. You vanished the probate, Holmes said, only long enough to create it. It was the silence that followed, yes, more than any word that came after, that I remember most distinctly. It was not the silence of denial or of calculation, but of a man setting down a weight that has become, in the final accounting, too heavy for the purpose it was meant to serve. I learned of the estate years before Sir Lionel died, the man said at last, in a voice stripped of its colonial ease and its cultivated composure, flattened to something simpler and, in its simplicity, almost ordinary. And I learned of the lack of heirs through legal employment of a kind that gave me access to correspondence not intended for my eyes. I had nothing. I had lost my colonial position. I had no family, no prospects, and no legitimate claim upon anything in England. He stopped. It seemed at the time the most natural use of what I knew. Holmes had already moved to the door, and his knock brought Lestrade's step upon the stair within moments. Chapter 10. Reputations Restored. The man who had called himself Adrian Baskerly left Carberry's chambers between two constables, with the quiet cooperation of someone who has, in the moment of exposure, passed beyond the territory where resistance offers any return. He did not speak again after his brief confession, and his silence on the stairs and in the street below had about it no particular dignity, but rather the blank, exhausted quality of a performance finally and irrevocably concluded. Lestrade managed the arrest with professional efficiency, and without the triumphant commentary he occasionally permitted himself on such occasions, for which I was privately grateful. The morning deserved better than theatre. Carberry stood at his window watching the cab until it had turned out of the lane, then remained with his back to the room for a moment longer in the manner of a man allowing a strong feeling to subside before he trusted himself to speak. When he turned, his expression was that of someone confronting an unwelcome revision of a long-held understanding. He sat in that chair, he said, indicating the seat Baskerly had occupied not a quarter of an hour before. He sat there on 3 separate occasions and spoke of his uncle with what I can only describe as genuine feeling. I believed him entirely. You were intended to, said Holmes, not without a gentleness that I noted as characteristic of him in the aftermath of these resolutions, see when the intellectual excitement had subsided and only the human remainder was left. His gift was not for fabricating emotion, it was for inhabiting it. There is a distinction, and it is one that defeats most observers, because we are trained by ordinary social experience to regard feeling as its own authentication. Carberry absorbed this without evident comfort. The law trusted its own machinery, he said. The registry trusted its own procedures, and I trusted my own judgment of character. Or he subverted all three simultaneously. He subverted none of them violently, Holmes replied. That was the elegance of it. He introduced himself into each system at a point where the system's own assumptions would carry him forward. The registry trusted Pritchard. Therefore anyone who successfully presented as Pritchard inherited that trust entire, without further examination. The law trusted its own documents. Therefore documents prepared to the law's standard were received as the law's own. And you trusted the feeling of a bereaved man. He moved to collect his hat and gloves from Carberry's side table. The schemes that defeat good institutions are rarely those that attack their weaknesses. They are those that exploit their strengths. We spent that afternoon attending to the several restorative tasks which the conclusion of the case required. The most pressing of these was the matter of Samuel Pritchard, who had now been confined in the Suffolk boarding house for the better part of 3 months, his professional life suspended, and his reputation subject to whatever private speculation his unexplained absence had generated among his colleagues. Holmes had sent word to him the previous evening, and we found him upon our arrival in a state of prepared readiness, his few belongings gathered, his account with the landlady settled from the small reserve he had managed to accumulate, and his manner carrying the particular forward-looking composure of a man who has resolved to regard an ordeal as concluded rather than continuing to inhabit it. I examined him briefly in my capacity as a medical man, and found him physically recovered to a reasonable standard, though thinner than was ideal, and with the residual pallor of prolonged indoor confinement. His mind, which had been his principal instrument throughout his career, was entirely sound. He asked 3 questions about the investigation, received Holmes's answers with the analytical attention of a man assessing evidence, rather than seeking reassurance, and expressed himself satisfied. He did not, I noticed, ask about Baskerly by name. He asked about the scheme, about its mechanism, and about what had enabled its detection, and the focus of his inquiry was that of a professional rather than a victim. It was, I thought, rather an admirable quality under the circumstances. Holmes had already communicated with Fothergill at Somerset House, and the reinstatement was arranged without unnecessary delay or ceremony. Fothergill, to his credit, expressed himself unreservedly in his apology to Pritchard, and the 2 men shook hands with the undemonstrative thoroughness of persons who have worked together long enough to dispense with elaboration. The registry settled back into its accustomed rhythm with the quiet efficiency of a mechanism that had been briefly disordered and was now restored to its proper calibration. The legal consequences unfolded over the following weeks, with the measured pace characteristic of English judicial proceedings. The man charged, whose true name proved to be Leonard Cyril Marsh, had indeed served as a second-grade clerk in the Ceylon civil service between 1885 and 1889, departing under the circumstances the register had recorded. His knowledge of English probate procedure had been acquired during a subsequent period of employment with a firm of London solicitors, from which he had resigned before any suspicion attached to him, but during which he had evidently formed the conception of the scheme in its broad outline. Its execution had required a further 3 years of preparation. Lestrade, who communicated these details to Holmes at intervals over the following fortnight with the slightly proprietorial air of a man presenting his own findings, was good enough to acknowledge that the case would not have proceeded beyond Thomas Hooper without Holmes's intervention. He expressed this acknowledgment in the qualified and parenthetical manner that was his habitual mode of dispensing credit, but the substance was genuine enough, and Holmes received it with the brief nod of a man for whom professional recognition is neither unwelcome nor particularly important. Sir Lionel's estate, with the fraudulent codicil set aside and the probate restored to its original provisions, passed in due course to the charitable institutions he had named in the body of his will. The principal beneficiaries were a school for indigent children in Wells, a fund for the relief of retired magistrates and their dependents, and the Somerset Archaeological Society, to which Sir Lionel had bequeathed his collection of Roman antiquities together with a sum sufficient for their proper housing and exhibition. Carberry administered the distribution with the scrupulous exactness of a man who regards the accurate execution of a client's intentions as a form of posthumous justice, which I believe it is. Of Mrs. Eliza Prentice, the aggrieved former housekeeper whose London visit had served so conveniently as a distraction, enquiries established that she had no knowledge of the scheme and no connection to Marsh beyond the coincidence of her grievance and his timing. She received, from the charitable provisions of the will, a small discretionary payment authorised by the trustees upon Carberry's recommendation, which I considered appropriate, and which Holmes, when I mentioned it, received with a slight smile and no comment. It was on a Thursday evening, some 3 weeks after the arrest. As Holmes and I sat on either side of the Baker Street fire in the comfortable silence of men with nothing immediately requiring their attention, that I raised the question which had been forming at the edge of my thoughts since Carberry's chambers. "He said he had nothing," I remarked. "No family, no prospects, no legitimate claim. I do not condone what he did, but the picture he drew of himself was not entirely without a kind of logic." Holmes was quiet for a moment, looking into the fire. "It was the truest thing he said," he replied, and he said it, I noticed, without self-pity, which is perhaps the only unperformed moment in the entire acquaintance. He reached for his pipe. "There are men, Watson, who might have applied the same intelligence, the same patience, and the same capacity for sustained attention to a legitimate enterprise and prospered by it. Or what diverts such a man toward fraud rather than honest effort is a question that lies somewhat beyond my professional territory, but I do not think it is a simple question." "And the most dangerous disguise?" I said, recalling the phrase he had used in another context. He lit his pipe and regarded the flame for a moment before shaking it out. "Is not the false beard, and not the assumed name," he said, "but the good reputation that has been borrowed rather than earned. It is the most durable of impostures, Watson, and the most difficult to detect precisely because the institutions we have built to protect us are designed to trust it." He settled back. "Machinery is trustworthy only so long as men are." The fire settled in the grate. Outside, Baker Street continued its evening commerce in the comfortable ignorance of the extraordinary transactions that had lately passed above it, and the case of the Vanishing Probate was closed,